I've never been a pet person or a people person. My life is pretty much a storyboard of my favorite scene with small variations: a clean room, a comfortable chair, a good book, an even better scotch, and some classic rock from the vinyl collection I inherited from my grandfather. I get called boring frequently, and my sisters are always on my case about it, but it's my life, you know. I wake up in the morning when my body decides it's time. No alarms, no demands. I roll out of bed and head to the kitchen where my French press sits on the counter. I make a nice breakfast, watch the sunrise while I finish my coffee. My house is on the smaller side, in a boring suburb, but I have it decorated just the way I like. 70s mid-century revival, tapered vintage furniture, geometric art, the works. I work from home as a consultant, analyzing data for companies that don't know I exist beyond the spreadsheets I send them. It's the perfect job for me: minimal interaction, maximum solitude. The work can be tedious, but it pays the bills, and I get lost in numbers, patterns, and figures. It's like solving puzzles, and I've always loved puzzles. Sometimes, if I'm feeling what constitutes wild for me, I play music while I work, smoke a little weed. I eat lunch, go for a run, shower, log back on again until I get however far I want to with my work projects, then cap off the day with dinner, a movie, a book, or both if it's the weekend. Every once in a while I'll catch up with an old friend or one of my sisters, but only every few months or so. If I'm being totally honest, solitude is what feels safest to me. My mom died when I was still in high school, and after my dad wasn't the greatest guy, to put it lightly, I spent my teens cleaning up his messes. Then, to make things more challenging, when I moved out, my college roommate was the same. After all that bullshit, I stick to a routine, keep things simple, no one coming home at 3 a.m. drunk off their ass, no pillow over the head to drown out the screams of adults that should know better. I was at the tail end of my usual quiet night in when I saw the dog, sitting in my favorite armchair, half asleep, trying to keep my eyes open long enough to get to the end of a chapter of I Am Legend. At first, I thought I imagined it, like my brain was so far turned off to reality that I had started conjuring up characters from the story, which, if you don't know, incidentally does feature a dog. But as I stared out my window, growing increasingly more awake, I knew the dog was real. It was a scruffy-looking thing, covered in mud, right in the middle of the yard. I could tell it was staring back at me through the window. It sniffed the air and sat down, wagging its tail in a way that was so pathetically hopeful, it had me sliding on my slippers and down the stairs before I even knew what I was doing. The truly odd thing about the dog being there was that it shouldn't have been able to get in. The fencing I have is a solid 8-foot wall of overlapping wooden slats. I'm in Colorado in an area with a lot of farms, and I had one of the companies that usually handles places like ranches come out to do it. It's completely gap-free and dug deep into the ground to stop anything from burrowing underneath. The whole thing's built like a fortress. According to my neighbors, it was this whole thing with the HO, so I was intrigued, to say the least. Like I said, puzzles always have a way of hooking me in, ever since I was a kid. My sisters have this inside joke that I'm like one of those folklore vampires, that you can stop me in my tracks if you throw me a tangle of knots. I made my way to the kitchen, lit by moonlight and silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I flicked on the porch lamp, illuminating the deck and the path that led to the unexpected visitor in my yard. I blinked out into the darkness, taking stock of the situation. The dog was big, really big, much larger than the usual mid-sized kind you see in suburban neighborhoods like mine. Its fur was grayish, shaggy, and matted, and it had obviously seen better days, like a stuffed animal that had been left out in the rain. Maybe a working dog that wandered off a farm, I thought. Something around the dog's neck caught the light. At first, it just seemed like a part of the shagginess, maybe a knotted clump of hair. It was a dark, bulky protrusion that stood out against its matted fur. But as the dog shifted, laying down more squarely under the beam of light, the object glinted. It was secured by what looked like weathered straps wrapping around the dog's thick neck. Curiosity piqued, I leaned in closer to the window, but it was hard to make out the details from that distance. The thought that it could be something like a collar for an invisible fence crossed my mind, but it looked too cumbersome for that. Definitely something more substantial and odd for a working dog. A puzzle strapped to another puzzle. I forgot to grab a sweatshirt, so I braced myself for the chill of the night air, unlocked the back door, and stepped out onto the deck. The porch light didn't quite reach the far corners of the yard, leaving the edges dipped in shadow. The yellow glow clashed with the blue moonlight, making everything, the clean-cut hedges, the angles of distant fences, look oddly disproportionate, out of space and time, like the cookie-cutter model homes on either side of my own repeated infinitely. As I edged closer, the gravel of the pathway crunched underfoot, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the night. The dog, noticing my approach, perked up. Its tail gave a cautious wag, and its eyes watched me intently, but it didn't make any move to come closer or run away. It just sat there, looking somewhat forlorn but oddly expectant in that way dogs always seem to do. I stopped a few feet away, giving it space, trying not to spook it. Up close I could see the object around its neck clearly. It was a camera, and a large one at that, secured with an elaborate harness that seemed out of place against its scruffy fur. Intrigued, I crouched down to the dog's level, carefully reaching out a hand. The dog sniffed the air, its nose twitching. There was a soft, warm intelligence in its brown eyes, buried under hairy eyebrows, clashing with its rough exterior. It stood up and took a few steps closer. "Hey there," I said softly. Without warning, the dog's lips pulled back into a snarl, spitting out a low, rumbling growl. I instinctively recoiled, heart hammering in my chest, kicking myself for not just calling animal control. I had completely forgotten my phone altogether. It was charging upstairs. And now I was in a dominant standoff with a massive dog, with, I soon realized, bigger balls than mine. Fuck. It was so tense, I barely breathed. But after a few agonizingly long minutes, I realized he wasn't looking at me. The dog's rigid body, pinned ears, and narrowed eyes were angled, fixed intently on something I couldn't see at the far end of the yard. Yet another thing I hadn't thought of. What if something else was out here with him? I squinted into the darkness, trying to discern what he might be seeing, but there was nothing. As I stood there, waiting for my pulse to settle, I watched the dog closely, readying myself to bolt for the back door if I needed to. I spoke to him in a low, soothing tone in an attempt to calm his nerves and mine. "Hey buddy, it's okay, there's nothing there. See?" I gestured towards the empty corner as if he could understand. The tension gradually left his body, his ears relaxed, and his tail began to wag, albeit hesitantly. After one last lingering glance at the corner of the fence, which unnervingly seemed to loom larger despite all reason, I knew it was time to bring the dog inside. I walked back to the door and held it open. The dog seemed to consider his options, then slowly made his way up the steps with a resigned, tired air and passed through the doorway. I shut the door behind us, cutting off the chill of the night. Inside, the dog paused, taking in his new surroundings. I led him to the fridge, where I had some cold cuts for sandwiches. Even with as little as I knew about pet care, I figured chicken would do in a pinch. I opened the package and poured the contents into a bowl, setting it on the floor. The dog approached it hesitantly, sniffed, and then began to eat with a sort of polite desperation. While the dog ate, I took a closer look at the camera strapped around his neck. The harness was complicated, with adjustable straps to keep it secure. It fit snugly around the dog's broad neck. I reached down and unbuckled it as gently as I could. The dog paused his eating to look up at me, eyes holding a flicker of anxiety. "It's okay, buddy," I reassured him, hoping I sounded authentic instead of how I felt, which was awkward. I couldn't remember when I last talked to a dog. I hesitated for a second, then scratched behind his ears. Seeming reassured, he went back to eating. When I pulled my hand away, it came back covered with a crust, and I winced, not wanting to think too hard about what it had been rolling around in. The harness and camera came free with a little more effort. A scattering of pebbles caught under the straps scattered over the tile floor. With the burden removed, the dog seemed visibly relieved, body relaxing, tail swaying. I set the harness on the table and walked to the sink. As I went to grab the dish soap, I noticed the color of the tacky gunk that coated my palm, a deep, rusted red. Dried blood. My heart leaped to my throat. I scrubbed my hands quickly, watching red-brown flakes swirl down the drain, wondering what on earth I had gotten myself into. I braced myself against the sink and considered my options, which were pretty few, considering how late it was, then grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from under the sink. Starting from his neck, where the harness had been, I checked his fur and skin, parting the matted fur as I looked for any signs of wounds. Thankfully, he remained calm, tail thumping lightly on the floor a few times like he enjoyed the attention. I couldn't find a single cut. Maybe he had rolled around in a dead animal. Even in my limited experience with pets, I knew they liked to do things that, a big reason we weren't allowed to have a dog growing up. I went to the closet and grabbed an old t-shirt that had been destined for the rag pile. I lathered it up with more soap and worked the cloth through his thick, matted fur, pulling away layers of that murky red mud, or at least, I told myself it was just mud. I toweled him dry and set him up comfortably on an old bath mat. Underneath all the muck, he had wiry gray curls and hair on his muzzle that curled into a little mustache. He sprawled out, looking quite content. Then I turned my attention to the camera that had been strapped around his neck. It seemed like it belonged on a wildlife expedition, not a suburban stray. I had enough familiarity with similar equipment to know it had all the marks of something expensive being repurposed, including labels scratched off for anonymity. The person that rigged it knew what they were doing, enough to make sure that whoever it belonged to originally wouldn't be able to prove it was theirs. I grabbed my spare laptop from my office and sat back down at the kitchen table, trying not to look too closely at the clock ticking down in the corner of the screen. I felt wide awake, anyway. I knew it wasn't going to be a simple plug-and-play situation. The camera was a heavy-duty piece with a connector that didn't match the usual USB cables I had lying around. Digging through my junk drawer hoard, I found an old universal adapter kit that seemed promising. I shuffled through the adapters until I found one that looked like it could fit the port. Success. Connecting it felt like a small victory, although I didn't have anyone to share it with. I looked down at the dog, and he thumped his tail once, like a little sarcastic, "Congrats." I attached the other end to my laptop with a hopeful kind of skepticism, half expecting it not to recognize the device. To my relief, after a moment of nothing happening, just when I thought it wouldn't work, it popped up, listed ambiguously as external device. Opening the camera's storage, I found a single file, a surprisingly regular AVI. As it loaded, I glanced down again at my new companion, sprawled comfortably by the table legs, watching me with a mix of curiosity and tired calm. "You're welcome," I said. He blinked at me and thumped his tail again. As an afterthought while I was waiting for the video to load, I got up and filled a bowl of water, which he slurped with enthusiasm. He made a complete mess of it, but I had to admit he looked cute while he did it. Even though I knew the video was loading, it still made me jump when the audio came on. "Alright, Augie, you look great. Ready to be famous." A woman's face came into frame, pretty, maybe in her mid-40s, with a smattering of freckles on her chin and forehead. The angle was close enough that you could see the laugh lines crinkling in the corner of her eyes as she smiled down at the dog. "Augie," I asked aloud as I eased myself back in the chair, checking to see the dog's reaction. His ears perked up and his tail batted against the ground, the fastest I had seen it move yet. The name suited him. In the video, Augie barked a few times, until the woman laughed and rose out of frame. The camera jostled as Augie bolted forward, the edges of the frame blurring with the rapid movement. Clay-colored boulders loomed large and vibrant on either side, their jagged silhouettes painted against a cloudless bright blue sky. The ground beneath Augie's racing paws was a mix of sand and stone that wound through the landscape, broken only by the occasional tuft of scrub grass. The frame tilted abruptly, the view skewed, and there was the sound of something skittering claws on stone. The camera now suddenly showed only a sliver of the bright sky and the rough, shadowed edges of rock on either side. Augie struggled, his whines echoing off the rock walls. In his excitement, he had misstepped and wound up tumbling into a narrow crack in the earth. The footage was chaotic, capturing every frantic movement as he struggled, the camera bumping and shaking erratically with his efforts to free himself. My stomach twisted with anxiety for Augie, even though I knew he was right next to me, without a scratch. I leaned down to pat his head and he rolled his eyes up to give me an appreciative look. "Tough day, eh, big guy?" He snorted and sighed as if agreeing, then closed his eyes again. In the video, somewhere in the distance, I could hear the woman yelling. She must have seen him fall. "Augie, stay calm boy, stay calm," she instructed. But despite her words, her tone was frantic. A few minutes later, the camera captured her leaning over the gap, panting as heavily as Augie, her face and tank top drenched in sweat as she reached down towards the trapped dog. "Easy, Augie, easy," she soothed, assessing the situation from above. Her fingers stretched towards him, but she couldn't reach far enough to grab hold of his harness. With a frustrated grunt, she pulled back, disappearing from the frame. Faintly, I could just make out her saying, "Damn, of all the fucking times, no service." Then silence. All that was left was the unsettling sound of Augie's distressed panting and the slight scraping of his paws against the rock as he continued to try to escape. Moments later, the woman's voice sounded again, this time brisk with purpose. "All right, honey, I found another way down. I'll be right there," she said off camera before she stepped into view again, sweat plastering her hair to her cheeks, pointing towards the left side of the screen as if he could understand her. And to his credit, the camera swiveled slightly as he perked up at her return, and he followed the gesture. The woman's descent into the cave was off camera, but after a few tense minutes, Augie was finally freed, his harness ripping just enough to pull it away from the rock walls. He scrambled up beside her, and she checked him over for any injuries, her fingers running through his fur. She hugged him, relief washing over her face, visible even through the grainy footage. "Good boy, Augie," she repeated over and over again, her voice thick with relief. The woman took a moment to wipe her face with the bottom of her tank top, scrubbing away the worst of the tears and dirt. Then, she stood up and surveyed their surroundings. Her gaze lingered on something to the side, the pathway she had taken to reach Augie. The camera on the collar captured her eyes tracing back along the dark, narrow tunnel. "Shit," she said quietly. Her expression turned contemplative, then concerned. The footage showed her walking a few steps back towards the tunnel entrance, peering into its craggy brown shadows. The rock was visibly unstable, debris wedged in the place she must have initially come through. For the next hour, she pulled at the fallen rocks, but they didn't budge, only sending a few smaller stones clattering down and raising clouds of dust. She tried the thin rift that Augie had fallen through but couldn't get the right vantage, slipping down the sides over and over again. Throughout the process, she screamed for help until her voice was hoarse. Apparently realizing the futility of her efforts, she stepped back, kneeling down to Augie, her face centered in frame as she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. The thin sunlight steaming through the cracks at the surface illuminated her face, accentuating her worried expression. "All right, Aug, no way out but forward it looks like. Remember I said today was going to be an adventure," she said, reaching a hand to pet his muzzle. She sighed. "I'm sorry, buddy. I should have paid attention to the signs. This is my fault. But I got us into this mess. I'll get us out." Her voice was determined. She gave his head a pat, jostling the camera. Then she took out a bottle of water from a fanny pack, taking a sip before offering some to Augie. I wondered what kind of signs she meant. Signs as in, she should have recognized how unstable the land was, or literal ones, as in, no trespassing. She pulled her phone from her fanny pack, tapping the flashlight on to augment the waning daylight that filtered weakly through the cracks above. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the uneven rocky terrain of the tunnel system they were now committed to navigating. The footage became increasingly more unsettling as they delved deeper into the cave system. The initial narrow, constricting tunnel opened up into a series of interconnected chambers that, while undeniably larger, had a vastness that was paradoxically claustrophobic. The light from the small flashlight seemed insignificant in the expansive spaces, the beam swallowed completely by the darkness. The walls were uneven, pockmarked with deeper pockets and crevices that were disorienting in how similar each footstep was to the last. Stalactites and stalagmites merged into pillars, petrified organic growths that looked almost alien. The paths narrowed into chokingly tight squeezes. The worst of the footage showed them approaching a particularly slim passageway, the walls seeming to press in from all sides. The woman had to turn sideways to fit, her back scraping against the rock, tearing her shirt and cutting into the flesh below. The sound was harsh, grating, unnervingly loud. Augie hesitated behind her, the camera bobbing as he seemed reluctant to follow, but with gentle coaxing and a soft tug on his harness, he obeyed. The woman seemed increasingly unnerved as well. Her breathing became heavier and her fruitless attempts to find service on her phone more frequent. Each breath seemed to bounce off the walls, creating a looping kind of anxiety. The woman paused, shining her light in a slow arc, the beam catching on distant, glistening wet rocks. "Augie, where are we?" she whispered, and it seemed scream loud after the oppressive silence. "My head is killing me, the pressure down here." She trailed off. Augie sighed, seeming to echo her sentiment. They pressed on for hours. Only once, they stopped and rested, eating a sparse meal of an energy bar and a plastic baggie full of dog treats. It was grueling and heartbreaking to watch. The whole point of it was to try to find out where on earth the dog had come from, and now, what happened to the woman who owned him, but I still felt a pang of guilt when I clicked fast forward. It felt like I was abandoning them, like I should get changed and do something, even though it obviously wasn't happening in real time. I settled for petting Augie again, who was so tired that he barely even twitched. Then, abruptly, the atmosphere in the footage shifted. There was, quite literally, a light at the end of the tunnel, bright, like it was high noon sunlight. A tense breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding escaped my chest as the camera moved forward. Augie's head angled down towards his uncertain steps. "Oh, Jesus, thank God, the woman said. She crouched down to put her arms around Augie's neck, covering the lens in the dark curls of her hair. Tears were visible on her cheeks, smudged with that red-brown mud. The hole was positioned awkwardly at the base of the tunnel's end, an irregular break in the cave wall, its edges rough and jagged. The woman approached cautiously, her figure silhouetted against the stark light, measuring the size with her hands before positioning herself to crawl through. She whistled for Augie, who seemed strangely hesitant to follow her, lingering in the darkness of the cave for a long moment before finally following her. The light intensified, turning the screen stark and white, filling the tunnel's exit with a blinding glow that seemed almost otherworldly. As the camera's exposure adjusted, the outlines of a large interior space began to crystallize on the screen. It was a room. Augie's camera, jostling slightly with each step he took, revealed smooth, concrete walls and high ceilings supported by thick concrete beams. A stark, utilitarian, man-made space that seemed like a different planet after so much time spent in the jagged confines of the cave system. There were shelves along the wall, sealed water bottles, stacks of blankets, and white boxes with red crosses that must have been medical supplies. Despite all the evidence, the realization still dawned on me slowly. The woman and her dog had stumbled into some kind of bunker. As Augie padded around the room, following the woman as she carefully explored the space, seemingly as confused as I was, the camera angled back to the wall they had come through. The stalagmites were visible through the torn rock. It looked as if something had burrowed into the side of it, or burrowed out. There was something next to the hole, a pile of wires, and maybe some other electronics, but Augie didn't linger long enough to get anything more than a blurry glimpse, even when I paused the video. Seconds later, there was a hollow clicking noise. The woman turned to face it. Augie followed her line of vision, and stared into the barrel of a shotgun. My stomach lurched, and the woman cried out, raising her arms. Augie, who must have sensed danger even if he didn't know what it was, took a few cautious steps back, growling, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. We've been wandering for hours, over a full day now, and we're not trying to do anything," she stammered. The shotgun belonged to another woman, tall, painfully thin, with long, stringy blonde hair. She was dressed in a sweatsuit that had seen better days, and her hands trembled where they held the gun, which she moved from side to side as if she wasn't certain to focus on the dog or the woman. "Mom," a voice called out. There was a shuffling noise off screen. Stay, Kyle. Stay with Corey and your father. Please, Augie's owner begged. I promise, we're not trying to. Mom, is everything okay? Kyle, I told you to stay. A small blonde head peered out from the side of the doorway. A little boy, as painfully thin as his mother. Please, I just need you to call 911 or I might have service now if you just let me. The mother and son turned to look back at Augie's owner, their faces shocked. They stayed in silence for a while. Augie turned his head back and forth to watch the standoff. Come on, the woman said, gesturing with the barrel of the gun. If that dog comes for me, you're both done. He'll be good. Augie's a good dog. And the woman said. No names. The blonde woman cut her off, her voice flat. I let out a hissing breath, my hands clenching into fists. An ominous thing to say, considering she had already called her son by name. She didn't want to humanize her. I wondered if the other woman realized, if she knew what a bad sign that was. Augie's claws scraped the concrete floor as he followed the women. He paused and looked at the boy, who looked at him with an intensely curious expression, like Augie was some kind of exotic species. The camera jostled as Augie followed his owner, her filthy hands still reaching towards the ceiling. As they were forced deeper into the bunker, they moved through a narrow hallway lined with pipes and flickering fluorescent lights that eventually gave way to a more open area. At the far end, there was a couch arranged like a bed, where a man lay connected to an IV stand, his features gaunt and pallid. Beside him, a little boy, Corey, I guessed, sat in a small chair, his unwashed blonde hair matching the woman's and the other boy's, his body equally thin and fragile looking. Sit, the blonde woman commanded. Augie did what he was told immediately, facing his owner, who did the same in a banged-up folding chair, one of a few that had been placed in a semicircle around the couch. The other two did the same, sitting on either side of Corey. The blonde woman never lowered the gun. Augie moved his head slowly, taking in the space around him. It was a makeshift living room, set up in such a way that it seemed more like an infirmary, everything looking out of place against the stark concrete walls. The woman and her two sons faced Augie and his owner. This strange, palpably tense tableau held for a moment, everyone frozen in place, as if waiting for someone else to make the next move. We used to have a dog, one of the boys, Kyle said suddenly. He was still staring at Augie. Quiet, the mother said. Then, after a beat, she spoke again. When did you come from? It was just outside of the state park in... Not where, she interrupted. When? I'm not sure what you mean. Just answer the question. The woman's harsh tone made Augie turn his head to focus on her. Well, it's 2024, Augie's owner answered slowly. The blonde woman's face twisted and went slack. She mouthed the numbers silently. But one of the boys started. There was a noise as he stood up from his chair, and Augie turned to look, the camera focusing on the two boys. Don't, Kyle. Dad said that would start happening, Corey said, looking down at the man on the couch. I said don't, their mother said, but she sounded defeated. But he did it, Mom. We don't know that. She could be lying. I'm not. Augie's owner interjected quickly. What year do you think it is? It's, the boy started to answer. Stop, their mother said, this time more forcefully. Why? Kyle asked, his voice a whine. Because I said so. But it's, both of you leave, go, right now, to the beds. Why? What did we do? Just go, Kyle, now. There was a shuffling noise as both of the boys seemed to obey. The woman moved to take the seat closest to the man on the couch. There was a long silence, the only sound in the camera, Augie's nervous breathing. There's a war, the blonde woman said abruptly. I'm sorry, Augie's owner asked haltingly. The blonde woman didn't answer. I'm just trying to understand. What kind of war? That's why you're here, like you're worried about a bomb. A bomb? The woman snorted, then barked out a laugh, then another, until it shifted into something indiscernible from a sob. God, a bomb. She wiped at her face, at her running nose. I wish. Another long beat of silence then. They tore it open, she said, almost too soft to hear. Tore what open? Everything, life itself. Life itself, what the fuck? I'm not trying to make trouble. If you show me where the exit is, or just let us go back to the caves. They're trying to fix it. The scientists that are left. My husband was one of them, but he came back to us. He says there's no solution, only a way out. Do you mean the cave? We can all go if you want. She took a deep breath. It's not an easy trip, but I can show you. The blonde woman ignored her, bending down to kiss her husband's forehead. As she leaned, her hair moved, revealing her neck. It was like looking at the middle of an autopsy. The back of her spine, visible above the collar of her sweatshirt, was mottled with bruises. In the center, blackened skin looked as if it was being burned in real time. Blood and pus leaked out of the wound, staining the fabric. It looked like bone was peeking from the places where the skin had given out. We can't go, the blonde woman said quietly, still leaning over her husband's prone body. It seemed as if Augie's owner saw what I saw, at least enough of it to add a tremble of desperation to her voice. Okay, I understand. What about if we just go? Me and my dog. She shifted in her chair. Please. Were you one of the ones he was talking to? Did you know? The blonde woman asked quietly. I what? No, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said he made contact before it. She took a shuddering breath. It doesn't matter. They're destroying the whole thing. It's not worth it, they said. Not worth losing it all. Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. Please. She stopped, cut off by the sound of the shotgun's safety. Augie, sensing the tension, made a small growl of warning. What's the camera for, then? The camera. The one on the dog, the big fucking one, right there. She gestured towards Augie. There was silence. I had forgotten about it. It's just something I bought online, for fun. Sure, the blonde woman scoffed. Suddenly, there was a rustling. They both turned to the man on the couch. Mike, the blonde woman asked, laying a hand on his head. Baby. Another rustling noise. The blonde woman started to wail. Oh no, oh, Mike, no. The man shuddered, as if having a seizure. Then, a deep, red stain bloomed on the top of the sheet. It rose, almost like the man was starting to sit up, but his head remained still, shaking, as if being pulled by puppet strings. The sheet continued to rise, almost comically, like a classic Halloween ghost. The blonde woman shot up out of the chair. It fell to the ground, clattering. She pointed the shotgun towards her husband, towards the rising white sheet. Mom, one of the boys distantly called. Stay back, she yelled. The sheet fell to the ground. For a split second, there was something there. Something long, twisted and bony, dripping with viscera. It unfurled, like the body of a man was a cocoon. Impossibly, its face unfolded from the air itself. It was large, featureless as a buffalo skull, but slick and grayish, like it had been pulled from the ocean. Its lower limbs strained awkwardly, as if it was something freshly born, clinging to the rubbery flesh it was still attached to. The blonde woman was sobbing hard, too hard. The shotgun slipped to the floor. She scrambled to the ground to try to retrieve it. The man's empty skin slipped to the ground as the last of the bony, rotating limbs ripped itself free. And the moment the last part of the creature left the man's body, it disappeared, like it was never there. I rewound the footage and paused it, just to make sure I didn't miss something in the shaky footage. Augie was moving his head back and forth between the chaos, but nothing changed. 1 second, the creature was there, and the next, nothing. At this point, the blonde woman seemed to truly panic. She moved wildly in a circle, the gun arcing in a shivering orbit. The lights overhead flickered. Augie's owner took advantage of the other woman's distraction. She bolted out of the chair, grabbed his harness, and pulled him towards the door. Augie was growling, the sound so deep that the camera shook. He dug down, resisting being pulled for as long as he could. Then they raced to the doorway. The two boys, who must have been drawn by the noise, stood together there, eyes wide with terror. The woman and Augie ran past them, down the hallway, back towards the storeroom they came in. In the flickering lights, the crack in the wall seemed thinner than when they first came through. The woman ran to it. Augie lingered in the doorway, looking down the dark hallway, growling. The lights went out, leaving them in total darkness. Come on, Augie, the woman whispered. The dog stared down the black hallway. For a long moment, there was silence. Then blood-curdling shrieks. The camera jerked back. The woman pulled Augie's harness, forcing him from the hallway. In a crush of moving limbs, she pulled him through the crack in the wall. For a few agonizingly long minutes, the footage was completely washed out, punctuated only by heavy breathing. Then, a close-up of the woman's tense face, bloodshot red eyes. She turned the flashlight on, held near her chin. She was shaking. "I'm sorry, Augie," the woman said, reaching out a hand to pet the dog. The sentence was laden with a tangle of emotion. There was a skittering noise, a distant rock falling. Augie turned to look at it. Then there was a scream, the sound of something hitting the ground hard. When the camera focused on her again, the woman was on her stomach, hands grasping the dirt. She still held her phone, and the light skittered on the cave walls. She dug her fingers in so hard one of her nails came off, blood seeping out. But she was pulled, quickly, forcefully, again and again. The crack in the wall was, against all reason, getting smaller, contracting impossibly fast. Something pulled at her legs one last time, and she was out of the cave, until only her bloody nails visible, barely clinging to the sides of the hole. And then those were gone too. Augie stared at the now closed wall like he couldn't understand what had happened. He whined and pawed at the slim line where the hole was. The wall shook hard. The dog jumped back, watching small rocks shudder on the ground. It shook again, like something was beating against it. Augie turned and started running, frantically navigating back out into the cave system. He wound his way through the darkness in a blind run, through passages that seemed smaller, seemed to be contracting, just like the hole. After what felt like an eternity but was only about an hour, the cave system seemed inexplicably shorter than before. Guided by what must have been scent, Augie discovered a barely visible break in the wall. Once again, he emerged, but not into the open canyon where he had started. It was a dark, cluttered space. It took me a moment to recognize what it was as his head frantically searched the room. My breath caught in my throat. It was a basement. It was my basement. Augie climbed onto a pile of boxes, then leaped towards the small window at the top of the wall. He squeezed through the rusted latch and through the narrow opening, his body contorting with effort as he pushed himself out into the night. He sat, panting, in the middle of the yard. Just a few minutes later, the last footage was me, standing in my pajamas in the back doorway. I don't know how long I sat at the table, staring at the dark screen, trying to process, but I know as soon as I came to, I ran, socks sliding against the tile, whipping open the door to the basement, flicking on the light switch, bounding down the steps two at a time. Augie must have woken up, because I could hear his claws clicking behind me. I flew past towers of cardboard boxes, past all the other crap I meant to throw away years ago, and then looked at the far corner. There was a crack in the wall, one that hadn't been there before. A small one, not big enough for a dog to fit through, especially not one as big as Augie, but there was a spray of churned rust-colored earth around it. I thought of the footage from the camera, the woman's hands disappearing behind the crack. Behind me, Augie started to growl. So, yeah, we got the fuck out there. And I still have a chair against the door, just in case. Not that I'm even sure that would help. I haven't decided what to do with the video yet. I need more time to think through it. I started searching local news sites and social media for any mentions of a missing woman with a dog. Then I broadened my search when I realized I couldn't be certain it even happened in Colorado. And then I thought, it could have been a movie, some student film made before I bought the house. When I moved in, there was shit in the basement. Maybe it was a prank and someone had lowered him over the fence. Then I had another thought that was even stranger, and bear with me because I know how insane it sounds, but I couldn't really even be sure that it was our reality to begin with. Whatever was going on down in those caves, if it was real, who's to say they didn't go missing from another reality altogether? On one hand, it seemed pretty fucking real. The continuous footage, the way Augie looked when he came here, the crack in my basement wall. On the other hand, well, I think that's obvious. The implications defy the laws of reality. Regardless of what's real, I love Augie. He's an awesome dog. He fit right into my life. He keeps me company through the day, goes on runs with me, has a ton of personality. I'm not really in the market to post flyers for. I don't even know who would be looking for him. A film student from the local college, a government agency, whoever might know more about whatever the whole thing was. He has episodes. That's what I've started thinking of them as, anyway. The times when he stares at a place where the shadows are thick, in the corner of a room, in a dark spot between the trees when we're on a walk, and the hair raises on his back and he starts growling, warding off bad memories maybe, but it makes me think of all the other times people swear their animals see something they can't. I think about the creature that seemed to just disappear, the mother's gaunt, listless face. They tore it open. I always make sure to give Augie extra head scratches, a few more treats, to make him feel better, or maybe to let him know to keep up the good work. All in all, I do know one thing for certain. I don't live alone anymore.